Hey everyone! This evening we're diving into the refined, structured, and frequently harsh realm of feudal Japan. It's a society defined by samurai loyalty, rigid traditions, and severe repercussions for missteps. This is the country of blooming cherry trees, exquisite verse, and everyday habits that would likely overwhelm most of us before midday. So, before you settle in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe if you truly appreciate the content here. And drop a comment letting me know your location and the current time. It's intriguing to discover who's watching from various parts of the globe. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle ambient noise, and let's gently embark on this exploration together. In feudal Japan, your life isn't something you decide upon waking. It's predetermined by your lineage, heritage, and ancestors long gone. Your position in the hierarchy isn't optional. It's a permanent assignment. If you come from a samurai lineage, consider yourself fortunate. You're now tasked with mastering the sword, the archery skills, and countless protocols for behaving correctly before your superior. If you're from a peasant background, well done. You'll spend the coming decades knee-deep in soil, and so will your descendants indefinitely. There's no such thing as a job application or launching your own venture. You're categorized as a samurai, peasant, craftsman, or trader, and that's where you remain. Attempting to shift classes isn't merely discouraged, it's subject to punishment. In feudal Japan, you don't ascend the social structure, you show deference to it. And we haven't touched on the ETA, the outcasts. These individuals handle matters involving death, such as butchering, carrying out executions, or tanning hides. The community relies on them, but acts as if they're invisible. They're akin to specters with essential roles, vital tasks, yet still like phantoms. Even among the classes, conditions deteriorate further. Suppose you're a trader, which might seem reasonable. You have wealth. But in feudal Japan, you're positioned near the lower end. The reason? You generate profit without physical toil, viewed as ethically questionable. Indeed, you're essentially penalized for being too productive to earn admiration. At the same time, peasants face such heavy rice levies that overpaying could lead to famine. Concealing portions for survival? That's considered betrayal, and executions are commonplace. As a samurai, you possess prestige, but you're perpetually anxious about offending your superior, your forebears, your clothier, or even your weapon by an ill-timed sneeze. Women aren't exempt either. Regardless of your status, your autonomy concludes where your patriarch's views commence. You'll wed as directed, submit as required, and be grateful if permitted to study verse. Thus, you're assigned a role and narrative from birth and thrust into society's performance, ready or not. It's graceful, lyrical, and oppressively unavoidable. And all this unfolds before your morning meal. You could assume feudal existence was all hardship and filth, but Japan approached sanitation with grave seriousness, almost reverently so, which appears appealing until you face it during the cold season. Your day commences with cleansing, not in a warm-tiled washroom with soft linens and scented cleansers, but at a rock basin supplied with frigid water drawn from a spring or brook. No warmth is available, no bargaining either. You rinse your face and limbs, trembling as though your predecessors are chastising you for existing. Cleansing agents are reserved for the affluent, and even those are derived from lye or grain husks, carrying an aroma like a monastic trial of resolve. In countryside regions, the shared bath facility, if one exists, serves as the focal point for cleanliness, a communal hub warmed by logs and occupied by locals. By shared, it means zero seclusion. You bathe alongside your acquaintances, employer, prospective relatives, and possibly your property owner, entirely unclothed and in quiet, feigning normalcy. You cleanse outside the tub first, then immerse. Purity is holy. Soiling the soaking water is akin to communal exile. But if no bathhouse is nearby, you clean whatever possible whenever feasible. You brush your teeth using salt or a branch. Your fingernails stay trimmed. Your garments are frequently ventilated. This isn't for fashion. Impurity is regarded as a disgrace both spiritually and communally. And if you're a samurai, the scrutiny intensifies. Your superior could examine you thoroughly at any moment. Untidy nails, shame, creased attire, insult, excessive scent during a salute. You might not recover from it. Women are anticipated to exude the fragrance of floral blooms and restraint. Bathing follows strict customs. Skincare is executed with tactical exactness, and hairstyles are crafted in intricate designs requiring hours. All this to operate a grain pounder while appearing composed. So indeed, feudal Japan emphasized cleanliness, profoundly so. But it demanded sacrifices, icy rinses, perpetual upkeep, and the ongoing spirit-diminishing realization that others were surely critiquing your personal hygiene. Suppose you're part of the martial elite, the samurai. It seems impressive, doesn't it? Ornate blades, luxurious garments, artistic duels beneath flowering trees. Now consider the details. Serving as a samurai in feudal Japan isn't merely about wielding a katana and proclaiming devotion. It's about avoiding any errors whatsoever. Your entire existence is ruled by Bushido, the warrior's path, a doctrine so stringent that even your lineage feels apprehensive. You don't exist for personal gain. You exist for your daimyo, your overlord. His command is absolute. His dispositions are like atmospheric shifts, and your duty is to attend to him with such fidelity that you'd prefer a gruesome end over a slight letdown. No stress there. Defiance? Disgrace? Setback? Disgrace. Elevating your tone improperly? Disgrace. Glancing askance at someone during a tea ritual? Naturally, disgrace. And disgrace isn't dismissed lightly. It's something you must rectify, often through your own demise. That's no exaggeration. It's seppuku, the ceremonial self-sacrifice required of fallen samurai. You position yourself, draw a brief dagger, and will halt there. You grasp the concept. This wasn't uncommon. It was esteemed, even honored, as a means to uphold respect. Falter significantly, and your overlord might provide a short blade and a secluded space, implying, "You understand the expectation." Beyond that, samurai were required to practice incessantly blade techniques, marksmanship, equestrian skills, tactics, script artistry, verse, all while upholding impeccable stance and a demeanor of someone unfamiliar with delight, only profound duty. Expressing amusement too boisterously, uncouth, displaying trepidation, frailty, or sentiment, disreputable. Your attire is exact, your blade immaculate, and your behavior so virtuous it discomfits others. And should you ever brandish your weapon in unwarranted fury, offend a higher-up, or fall in combat, you don't merely lose, you forfeit all. Being a samurai isn't centered on acclaim. It's about control, reticence, and navigating daily life without a misstep. So yes, you appear striking in protective gear, but you're a single facial tick from profound crisis. So, you didn't enter the world as a samurai, No blade, no verse, no risk of theatrical self-harm. That's the upside. The downside, you're a commoner, meaning your life is a blend of grime, exertion, aches, and obligatory grain submissions mandated by authorities. You rise with dawn not for harmony with the environment, but because land duties won't fulfill themselves. Plus, your reed-roofed dwelling lacks entrances, panes, and a stray animal just traversed your sleeping pad. Morning meal, if fortunate, consists of grain mush and remnants of preserved produce from prior days. If unlucky, it's feigning satisfaction with a gulp of stream liquid. Then you head to the paddy fields, which appear tranquil in tourism films, but are truly mire traps crafted to erode your spirit across a dozen hours. You sow, you clear weeds, you wish for no outlaw assaults today, and as dusk falls, you hobble back, only to learn an animal has vanished and the community leader wishes to discuss your crop deficit. Levies are unyielding. Compensation isn't in currency. You remit in grain. Your kin consumes the remnants, which aren't plentiful, particularly if yields were poor, or if your superior's kin inadvertently trampled your field amid training. Feel like protesting? How charming. You can't. Retorting earns lashes, banishment, or elevation to lifeless status. If exceptionally fortunate, you could ascend to community senior, where advice is sought but disregarded promptly. And recall, departing your settlement without consent is forbidden by law. You're essentially a grain-bound captive with periodic foot ailments. Celebrations do occur. You indulge in diluted rice wine, move in formation, and avoid contemplating the imminent sowing period in mere days. So yes, you're the bedrock of commerce, the provider for samurai sustenance, and the individual overlooked by all. And no, leisure days aren't granted because feudal Japan values diligence, inherited hardship, and maintaining aspirations profoundly modest. You're famished. Of course you are. You've been laboring, sowing, perspiring, and courteously evading demise since first light. Time for sustenance. But in feudal Japan, repasts aren't for extravagance. They're for endurance, modesty, and avoiding a skeletal obstruction before relatives. If you're a commoner, your fare is grain. Grain at dawn, grain midday, grain at dusk. If blessed, it's genuine grain. If not, it's millet masquerading as such. Perhaps a root vegetable or preserved turnip if fortune smiles. Flesh? Reserved for the overlord, or for that fowl that eyed you oddly and vanished inexplicably. Seafood occasionally, but desiccated, preserved, and abrasive enough to sharpen dentition. Broth, typically fermented paste, if you deem heated saline with drifting foliage as such. It's savory, certainly, much like ocean fluid is quenching. Now, as a samurai, you receive superior nourishment, but you partake last, following your superior, his visitors, and whomever he aims to captivate. That equates to chilled grain, cooled broth, and the perpetual delight of observing others dine while feigning profound privilege in delay. Moreover, all is timed by seasons, not for vogue, but due to absent preservation, absent worldwide distribution, and if you didn't cultivate it, it likely doesn't exist. Thus, winter signals nature's hint at abstinence. And woe if you suffer alimentary illness. Healing is hopeful. Local cures involve reclining and contemplating lineage. You'll recover or join them. Pilfering edibles is grave offense. Appropriate a serving of grain, and it's not a mere reprimand. It's a communal spectacle of why one avoids the superior's provisions. Infusion, present, but not as envisioned. The infusion ritual is an intricate display more about carriage, decorum, and profound modesty than alleviating dryness. So yes, repasts are revered, hushed, and deferential, but predominantly flavorless, meager, and including at least one textured enigma. And no, complaints aren't permitted, unless you desire your subsequent intake administered nasally. So, you've concluded your humble serving of, perhaps, fish broth. Someone utters nonsense. Perhaps your superior recites flawed verse. Perhaps the community senior errs. Perhaps your adjacent dweller claims his livestock forecasts climate. And for a rash instant, you contemplate rectification. Refrain. In feudal Japan, your viewpoint is a hazard. Unrestricted expression isn't recognized. It's a swift route to humiliation, expulsion, or abrupt termination via blade. The societal order is inflexible, and each utterance carries significance. Address beyond your rank? Impertinence. Critique a superior? Arrogance. Deliver a jest that falters? Bordering on disloyalty. Even in households, caution prevails. Offspring don't disrupt progenitors. Spouses don't amend partners. And absolutely nobody challenges the overlord, unless eager to probe eternity via point. Samurai are instructed to communicate with deliberate serenity, even enraged. A cutting remark is worse than an ineffective weapon. It's improper, perilous, and could compel another to eliminate you to reclaim prestige. This leads to regrets. In feudal Japan, expressions of remorse are masterful. You don't merely utter apology, you prostrate, you abase, you might compose verse on your ignominy. You could dispatch a token like a living avian or ornate accessory, earnestly wishing the recipient opts against confrontation regardless. And misfortune if your manner is overly informal. A misplaced term might be construed as mockery, rebellion, or inner decay. Quietude is nearly always preferable. Even wit is precarious. Amusing at impropriety could signify contempt. Sharing mirth with prominence might suggest equality, and that's how relocations to remote areas occur mysteriously. So yes, speech is technically unrestricted, but practically you affirm, grin, and hope your thoughts remain contained. For in feudal Japan, unrestrained words don't merely capsize vessels, they demolish standings, reputations, and occasionally lineages. In feudal Japan, attire isn't for personal statement, it's for ensuring others instantly recognize your inferiority via your garment details. Your garb doesn't mirror your character. It mirrors your rank, function, and legality to bear arms without samurai intervention. Commencing with elites, samurai don multiple silk layers, occasionally reinforced, perpetually stately. Their ensembles are meticulously composed to indicate standing and preparedness. Hues like profound indigos, natural tans, and sporadic crimson accents, refined, foreboding, and nearly always suggesting, I've ended lives for lesser sartorial offenses. And naturally, the blades. A samurai's paired long and short swords transcend armament, they're ambulatory emblems of command, unsheathed publicly only as final measure. Worn incorrectly, initial toward sharp public amendment. Commoners, conversely, wear coarse fabric and modesty. Earthy tones predominate your array, not from minimalism, but because pigmented cloth demands funds and survival preempts color coordination. Your ensemble declares, indeed, I toil in mire. No, this wasn't chosen. Yes, These are my sole footwear. Traders don superior textiles. They possess wealth, after all, but socially beneath samurai and laborers, so they mute it. Affluent, yet restrained. Silk, certainly, but subdued. Prosperous trading clans excel at appearing sufficiently honorable to evade notice from idle patrols. Craftsmen attire neatly yet humbly. Their garb is sturdy, functional, and crucially inconspicuous. Attracting notice is deemed a flaw. Then women must balance poise, compliance, and layered emblems. Coiffures encode meaning. Robe designs follow seasons. And if you select a shade for the wrong occasion, you've shamed your kin and potentially ignited local murmurs. In essence, attire transcends clothing. It's about standing, ceremony, and enduring daily scrutiny from divinity and kin. You're envisioning nocturnal strolls under floral canopies, murmured verse beneath translucent shades, maybe a fervent embrace between a warrior and restricted nobility. Not quite. In feudal Japan, affection is a secondary pursuit, unlikely to conclude successfully. Union isn't about sentiment, it's about coalitions, position, grain duties, and avoiding ancestral embarrassment. As a commoner, your match is orchestrated by guardians, and perhaps the village senior. Romantic suitability isn't addressed. Robust limbs and sound dentition matter more. If from samurai stock, stakes escalate. Matches are political instruments, selected to fortify alliances, secure holdings, or settle disputes with fine garb. Objective isn't joy, it's constancy, ideally stable through reaping. Affectionate missives, possibly, but only in flawless script with apt seasonal allusions, conveyed discreetly by an attendant who knows excessively. Women, naturally, have minimal input. A warrior's offspring might wed at 15, mastering script, manners, stitching, and silently masking dissatisfaction. Her role: produce heirs, present infusion, and never romance the melody instructor. Genuine passion, with furtive looks and ardent vows, belongs to bards, dramas, and sorrowful spectral tales. To encounter affection in feudal Japan, observe a theatrical piece about fated paramours dissolving into vapor, and if you deviate from prescribed bonds, fortune favor you. Infidelity could yield banishment, shame, or lethal blade disapproval, executed by partner, superior, or kin, whichever arrives first. Even for samurai, secondary partners were routine, but that complicated matters further, merely adding more to disappoint wordlessly. So yes, affections arose covertly, agonizingly, often with unsuitable counterparts at inopportune moments. Because in feudal Japan, love wasn't prohibited, it was perilously disruptive. In feudal Japan, mortality isn't remote. It's your associate, colleague, cohabitant, who evades dues yet lingers perpetually. You don't prepare for leisure years, you arrange your departure. For death isn't calamity here, it's scripted. Begin with samurai. These dignified fighters carry dual blades and personal exit strategies. Battle defeat, seppuku. Honor tarnished, seppuku. Beverage spill on superior's attire, seppuku with theatrical accompaniment. And it's not secluded. It's communal, ritualistic, performed with tea-like exactness, albeit with far more visceral harm. But peasants aren't spared longevity. As cultivators, crop failure means hunger. Village quota shortfall? Your remains might exemplify sternly. Aridity, epidemic, marauder incursion. Select your abrupt end. and fortune combating it with advanced remedies like warmed infusion and fervent botanical faith. Regarding marauders, they're genuine, ubiquitous, indifferent to your radish cultivation efforts. Pathways beyond settlements are so hazardous, travel is avoided unless imperative. Perhaps next year for kin visit translates to I value existence. For women, parturition is chance. Issues? Unfortunate. Attendance aid, but interventions mostly urge fervent supplication and additional linens. If your partner perishes dishonorably, you might follow, not sentimentally, but literally via dagger. And nature, tremors, inundations, surges, scarcities. Japan excels at calamities. Your abode could vanish or entomb any time. Sole safeguard, secure covering, and profound philosophical resignation. Yet darkest, calm acceptance is mandated. Lamenting dread or defying destiny is unseemly. True valor prostrates to mortality, crafts verse, and confronts conclusion like routine kin gathering. So yes, feudal Japan is picturesque, but demise integrates into aesthetics. In contemporary existence, pursue aspirations, embody authenticity, embrace verity. In feudal Japan, verity is clan-dictated. Selfhood isn't merit, it's alarm. You persist not as solitary fate beacon, but minor limb on vital ancestral arbor, tasked with preventing conflagration from mortifying acts like voicing views or romancing a traitor's progeny. Clan is paramount. Your essence, prestige, prospects, all channeled via surname. You're ensnared in obligations, prestige, expectations so dense it's ethereal ledger. Even samurai, proud guardians, battle not personally, but for overlord, domicile, forebears. Demise ideally elevates superiors. Honorable and one matter, but clan embarrassing. Generational torment. Your deeds reflect patriarch. Patriarchs reflect antecedent. Antecedents might influence cousins' treatment provincially. It's not association culpability, it's association existence. Desire noodle enterprise from culinary passion? Endearing. Regrettably, clan breeds equines, so grooming until notified otherwise. Painting interest? Splendid. Adorn clan-sponsored shrine per guidelines, silently. Avoid scandal, one untimely liaison, inebriated episode, or overly audacious verse, and disgrace cascades. Siblings ostracized. Matriarch humiliated. Distant kin might self-eviscerate for restoration. You're not individual. You're delegate, pawn, ambulatory risk. Yet, enact role adeptly, prostrate timely, wed as instructed. Clan might utter your name with approximate esteem. That's feudal Japan's personal accolade. Suppose you've endured hierarchy, duels, prestige framework, grain duties. Well done. Now endure climate. Feudal Japan is natural splendor masterpiece. Snowed peaks, tranquil woods, flowering blooms. An environmental turmoil nightmare. Vista magnificent. Weather lethal. Commence with cyclones. Immense tempests arriving wrathfully, delivering precipitation, gusts, and reed barrier fragility. Coverings detach. Pathways dissolve. Season's sown grain drifts serenely. Then quakes. Abrupt, fierce, unforeseeable. No alerts. Just rumble, momentary existential bewilderment. Then domicile tilted. Survive agitation? Fires loom. Everything timber, including choices. Inundation frequent. Excessive downpour swells waterways. Settlement becomes sludge vessel. Yields submerge. Livestock stray. Proprietor demands duties, naturally, with accrual. Arid periods equally merciless. Prolonged scorching, scenes moisture, cracks terrain, desiccates paddies like ascetic wit. You supplicate deities, enact ceremonies, eye adjacent wells suspiciously. Then winter, not enchanted snowscape, rather penetrating chill, scant coverings, flames extinguishing midnight. Warmth isn't centralized, it's shared affliction, palms over earthen heater, hoping digit loss unfashionable. Volcanoes sporadically participate. Japan ring of fire. Eruptions in tomb regions and residue. Molten or realization shrine, now pebble arrangement. No relief agencies. Abode collapses. Reconstruct. Provisions spoil. Starve. Superiors' holdings affected. Duties persist. Calamity no exemption. In feudal Japan, environment isn't backdrop. It's perpetual cue even divinities might err. In feudal Japan, authority cascades downward, as do duties, anticipations, culpability. Deem yourself significant? Reconsider, superior always exists. As commoner, existence governed by settlement, chief answering local warrior, answering overlord, answering military ruler, perhaps murmuring to sovereign who haunts capital in lavish attire rather than governs. Even samurai, fierce justice enforcers, aren't apex. They serve superior, await directives, sporadically combat conflicts uninitiated over unowned holdings for unpersonal acclaim. Theoretically esteemed, practically ornate intermediaries with blade. Overlords, provincial controllers with forces, seem invulnerable until military ruler deems them audacious. Then fortresses scrutinized, correspondence seized, ambitions delicately severed. Even military dictator, Japan's potent figure, must monitor court, clans, finances, at least 4 kin attempting infusion poisoning. He governs, yes, but restlessly. Meanwhile, sovereign theoretically surpasses all, yet powerless, like untouchable relic. He sanctions ceremonies, epics, occasionally verses. Likely impoverished. Hierarchy inflexible. You're positioned. Remain like dutiful miniature tree. Aspiration isn't lauded. It's dreaded. Ascend higher, nearer dorsal blade. Deference upward, enforcement downward. Commands obeyed, undebated. Descent hazardous. Hint above station? Not aspiration. Demise wish formally attired. So wherever, commoner, trader, warrior, superior, higher entity dictates fate, lower hopes stumble. In feudal Japan, learning, and if any, hinges on hierarchy position. Alert, near base, ladder mostly unseen, occasionally ablaze. Commence apex, samurai offspring fortunate, youthfully trained in literacy, blade arts, manners, verse, marksmanship, equitation, perpetually unimpressed expression. Samurai youth composes demise, verse by 14. You mastered script basics. Education rigorous, purposeful. Serve, safeguard, avoid clan shame. Study Oriental classics, warrior tenets, prostration so exact divinities note. Then trader, craftsman kin, receive some, arithmetic, records, perhaps literacy, but business essentials, not classics, turnip bulk costing. Commoner offspring education, hoe, grain, commence pre-dawn. Guardians instruct cultivation, survival, courteous non-demise before collector, literacy scarce. schooling extravagance, sole document, tree affixed explaining levy increase, girls, unless elite, minimal formal, trained domestically, stitching, manners, infusion rites, household silence. Fortunate might learn script, verse, if not distracting from precise folding. Education in feudal Japan isn't self-advancement, it's role fulfillment, unquestioningly. Learning leisurely would stun elders into beverage. So yes, knowledge power, hence tightly regulated. Feudal Japan land of stunning visuals, from fan arc to vessel placement, seemingly soul-soothing, ancestral impressing. But judged. Culture isn't mere art, performance with repercussions. Flower arrangement, infusion pouring, garb folding follow ancient codes predating lineage. Misplaced petal, village gossip, unflatteringly. Infusion rite appears serene ritual, actually social hazard. All timed, motions orchestrated. Visitor sits precisely, rotates vessel twice, utters modest thanks, sips quietly, mentally assessing prostration timing. Error? Mildly uncomfortable best. Worst, character defect, or inherited failing from shameful antecedent. Then script artistry, expressive beauty, incorrect, discipline test, essence, spirit alignment, stroke not ink, soul carriage reflection, untidy, sign unstable, poor prostration, even verse perilous, haiku seasonal, correct medium, metaphoric referencing nature, emotions sans excess personal, fervor, lacking polish, unrefined, arid, spiritually frigid, clever, ostentatious, now moon view exclusion, culture delicate contest, participate not relax, prove composed, polished, mortally fearful, uncultured appearance. Beauty in feudal Japan isn't casual, silk-robed conflict. If floral setup deviates, divinities mercy your miniature tree. After hierarchy, hygiene, prestige, endless grain, honestly, you wouldn't endure day in feudal Japan. Not weakness, softness, but society-designed submission, exactness, silent, unyielding compliance. Every instant posture test, fidelity, precise prostration, depth reciting seasonal salutation, correct tone. Fail, repercussions, public humiliation best, ritual demise worst. No leisure, self-being. Born role, given narrative, perform lethally graceful lifelong. Deviation not valiant, hazardous, individual irrelevant, clan superior, terrain matter. Samurai bore centuries prestige, real poetry, recitation, pre-self-incision threat. Peasant toiled till spine queried, hoping climate, superior non-betrayal. Woman life managed grace, silence, forfeiture. Others? System ensured stasis, feudal Japan beautiful, breathtaking. Structures, ceremonies, verse, art meticulously arranged. But beauty edged sharply, demanded discipline, bone-snapping, required deference absolute, individuality engulfed. So, no, you wouldn't endure. You'd misspeak, overlaugh, left foot threshold. Forget prostrate, query, desire alteration. That threatens order. But that's feudal Japan's brilliance, tragedy, not easy, enduring. In an age where women were barely allowed to speak in public, let alone command an army, Artemisia of Caria existed like a historical glitch. Someone who, by all the rules of ancient society, should not have been possible. And yet there she was, seated on a throne, wearing the double burden of queen and naval commander, plotting war alongside some of the most powerful men of the ancient world. Artemisia ruled Halicarnassus, a city nestled along the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Technically a vassal under the sprawling Persian Empire, Halicarnassus was part of a patchwork of territories, often caught in the gravitational pull of regional powers. But Artemisia didn't simply inherit a political position. She made it dangerous. She was Greek by blood, Persian by loyalty, and a woman by biology. Each identity carrying immense weight in an age dominated by iron and testosterone. Her father was likely of Carian descent, while her mother hailed from the island of Crete. Upon her husband's death, instead of stepping aside for a male successor, Artemisia claimed the reins of power. That was already an act of quiet defiance. But she didn't stop at ruling. She wanted to conquer. When Xerxes the Great launched his legendary invasion of Greece around 480 BCE, Artemisia did something no other woman of her time dared. She volunteered for war. Not to stitch bandages or offer prayers from a safe distance, but to command ships and risk death. She supplied 5 of her own vessels, sleek, fast, deadly, and led them personally into the thick of battle. And Xerxes, ruler of an empire stretching from India to Egypt, didn't just tolerate her presence. He listened to her, valued her. It was a bold move. Some would say foolish. A Greek fighting for Persia, treasonous. A woman on a warship, unthinkable. But Artemisia knew what she was doing. She wasn't motivated by loyalty to bloodlines or empires. She was playing the game of survival and power, and she played it better than most of the men around her. In a world carved up by men with swords, Artemisia didn't ask for permission. She built her fleet, sailed into history, and dared anyone to stop her. By siding with Xerxes, Artemisia effectively declared war on her own people, the Greeks. It was a decision that raised eyebrows even before a single oar hit the water. And it wasn't just the usual whispers of treachery. This was personal. To the Greeks, she was a traitor in fine robes, a queen turned mercenary, a woman who had traded heritage for favor at a foreign king's table. But Artemisia didn't seem the least bit bothered. In fact, she doubled down. She sailed into the campaign like she belonged at the high table of Persian power. And in many ways, she did. Xerxes, famous for surrounding himself with brutal warriors and sycophants, found in Artemisia something he rarely encountered: honesty. Blunt, piercing honesty. She told him not what he wanted to hear, but what he needed to know. In council meetings, surrounded by decorated generals and satraps with bloodied boots, Artemisia spoke with clarity and strategy, and she was rarely wrong. Her advice was sharp, tactical, and often laced with warnings others were too proud to voice. Before the infamous Battle of Salamis, she urged Xerxes to avoid direct naval confrontation with the Greeks, warning that the cramped straits would nullify Persia's numerical advantage. But Xerxes, swayed by overconfidence and flattery, ignored her. That decision would come back to haunt him. Even among her Persian allies, Artemisia's presence was complicated. Many commanders resented her authority. After all, she wasn't just a woman. She was a Greek woman, one who told truth to power and led her own ships with unnerving precision. She wasn't there as a figurehead or symbolic mascot. She was there to win. And that unsettled more than a few mustachioed warlords who'd spent their lives in the business of conquest. Meanwhile, back in Greece, her name spread like a stain. Herodotus himself, from Halicarnassus, seemed both fascinated and baffled by her. He documented her with a mix of awe and suspicion usually reserved for mythical creatures. To some, she was Medusa in a breastplate. To others, a misunderstood genius with the audacity to think like a man, and better than most of them. Artemisia was many things: loyalist, strategist, traitor, visionary. But above all, she was a political animal who understood one hard truth. In war, identity bends. Only power remains. If there was ever a stage that tested Artemisia's brilliance and boldness, it was the Battle of Salamis. This wasn't just any battle. It was the naval showdown of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian fleet, massive and overconfident, squared off against a much smaller but strategically positioned Greek navy in the narrow straits near Athens. It was here that Xerxes' campaign would falter, and it was here that Artemisia would make one of the most shocking tactical moves of her career. Let's rewind slightly. Artemisia had warned Xerxes not to engage the Greeks in these narrow waters. She argued correctly that their superior maneuverability and familiarity with the terrain would nullify the Persian size advantage. But Xerxes, intoxicated by numbers and pride, dismissed her warning. He wanted a spectacular victory. What he got instead was humiliation. As the battle raged, chaos swallowed the Persian lines. Ships collided, formations broke, and Greek triremes darted like sharks between lumbering vessels. It was a slaughter, and in the middle of it all was Artemisia, commanding her flagship, surrounded by allies and enemies, trying to survive a collapsing battle. Here's where things get wild. With a Greek ship pursuing her relentlessly, Artemisia made a decision that historians still debate today. She ordered her ship to ram and sink another Persian vessel, one from an allied king, no less. The move was so unexpected that the Greeks, assuming she must be on their side, stopped chasing her. She slipped away untouched. Xerxes, watching from a hilltop, supposedly witnessed this and turned to his aides, exclaiming, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." It was perhaps the highest praise he ever gave a subordinate, especially one who had just sacrificed a friendly ship to save herself. But Artemisia's move wasn't just about survival. It was strategy, misdirection, and cold-blooded calculation wrapped into one. She read the battlefield in real time and made a split-second decision that saved her ship, her crew, and possibly her own life. It was controversial, it was brutal, but it worked. While many Persian commanders died that day or fell into disgrace, Artemisia sailed back not as a failure, but as one of the only leaders Xerxes still trusted. The Persian fleet limped back from Salamis humiliated. Ships were lost, morale shattered, and the myth of Persian naval invincibility obliterated. For many commanders, this was the beginning of the end. But for Artemisia, it was a strange kind of triumph. In the middle of a disastrous campaign, she emerged as the lone figure of competence, someone who had warned the king, acted decisively, and escaped unscathed. Xerxes took notice. Now back on land, licking the wounds of defeat, the Persian war machine had to pivot. And in a rare moment of candid trust, Xerxes turned once again to Artemisia, not as a novelty, but as his most reliable advisor. He asked her a deeply personal question. What should he do next? Artemisia, ever blunt, told him exactly what no proud emperor wanted to hear: retreat. She urged him to return to Persia and leave his trusted general Mardonius in charge of the remaining campaign in Greece. You've achieved what you needed. Athens has burned. Don't push your luck. That was essentially her message. And incredibly, Xerxes listened. The man who had ignored most of his war council followed the advice of a single woman. It was a moment that confirmed what others had only suspected. Artemisia wasn't just brave. She was politically lethal. She knew when to fight, when to deceive, and now when to walk away. Her power didn't come from brute force. It came from clarity, something in short supply among kings and conquerors. In the aftermath, she was entrusted with the guardianship of Xerxes' sons, an honor that spoke volumes. In ancient courts, you didn't hand your heirs to just anyone. You chose someone whose loyalty was ironclad and whose judgment could be trusted. Artemisia, a woman born on the fringes of empire, had now placed herself right at its heart. Back in Halicarnassus, she returned not as a queen uncertain of her place, but as a figure of undeniable consequence. Her legend began to take root. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was the woman who stood face to face with empires and didn't blink. Where most would have sought safety and silence, Artemisia had stepped into war and somehow came back more powerful than when she left. While Artemisia's military feats gained her notoriety, her legacy didn't grow alone on the battlefield. It also thrived in the minds of those who recorded it, especially in the pen of Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who just so happened to be born in Halicarnassus, the very city Artemisia ruled. This geographic coincidence added an almost eerie intimacy to his account of her life. He wasn't writing about some distant myth. He was writing about his queen. And yet, Herodotus didn't present her as a caricature of feminine virtue or villain. He painted her as something much rarer in historical record, a competent, calculating, and compelling leader. His account of the Battle of Salamis highlights not only her courage, but her cold pragmatism, the sinking of the Allied ship, the escape under Greek confusion, the brutal brilliance of it all. In Herodotus's work, Artemisia becomes more than a commander. She becomes a contradiction, both admired and feared, respected and suspected. But make no mistake, that respect was hard-earned. She existed in the shadow of men, powerful ones like Xerxes and Mardonius, but somehow she outshone them all. While they drowned in ambition, she floated on foresight. She knew when to fight and when to vanish. That kind of wisdom is rare. Rarer still when it comes from a woman in a world that equated femininity with fragility. And perhaps that's what intrigued Herodotus the most. Artemisia didn't fit. Not in the cultural mold of her time, and certainly not in the comfortable categories historians like to build. She wasn't a rebel, but she disobeyed. She wasn't a feminist, because the concept didn't exist, but she undermined patriarchy through competence alone. Her legacy spread quietly, not through monuments or golden statues, but through stories, echoes passed along by men who were forced to admit she was better than them. In war councils, she outthought them. In battle, she outmaneuvered them. And in politics, she outlasted them. For all their noise, the men of her time ended up needing scribes to keep their memory alive. Artemisia had something better. Or, as Herodotus put down his scroll and dipped his pen again, he wasn't just writing history. He was recording a riddle in the shape of a queen. Strangely enough, the name Artemisia didn't vanish after her death. About a century later, it returned, this time in the form of another queen, Artemisia II of Caria, a namesake and likely descendant who also ruled Halicarnassus. But while the second Artemisia never commanded fleets in battle, she too would carve her name into the bones of history, quite literally. Her claim to fame, building one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. The second Artemisia commissioned this towering marble tomb for her husband Mausolus, who was also her brother, because ancient dynastic politics never failed to get awkward. But it wasn't just a tribute to grief. It was a statement, a monument to Carian identity, and an echo of the strength that the first Artemisia had once wielded. Historians have long debated whether the two women were directly related, mother and daughter, aunt and niece, possibly not related at all. But one thing is clear. The name Artemisia had by then become synonymous with power, intellect, and bold rule. The legacy of the original queen had seeped so deeply into the identity of Halicarnassus that future generations wore it like armor. Even more fascinating is how the later Artemisia's mausoleum gave us the very word we use today for monumental tombs: mausoleum, a linguistic legacy born from stone, grief, and political theater. And while the second Artemisia was known for mourning, she was also a capable ruler, continuing the thread of female leadership in a corner of the ancient world where that was anything but normal. But let's not forget the foundation for all of this was laid by the first Artemisia, the naval commander, the queen who advised Xerxes, the woman who navigated the Greek world as both insider and outsider. Without her, the name might have faded. Halicarnassus might have been just another forgotten city on a forgotten coast. Instead, it became a beacon, a place where two powerful women shaped history, not through accident, but through audacity. Their stories, though separated by time, speak to each other across the centuries, one with ships, one with stone, and both with names history could not quite bury. Artemisia's story has always lived in the in-between, between empires, between genders, between legend and history. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the way her legacy has been argued, bent, and reinterpreted over the centuries. Was she a Persian puppet, a Greek traitor, or simply a sovereign playing chess while others were busy swinging swords? To Persians, she was a loyal commander, one of the few who gave sound advice and fought with distinction. Xerxes clearly trusted her more than many of his seasoned generals. That in itself speaks volumes about her political sharpness and composure under pressure. In the Persian world, her loyalty was seen as honorable, perhaps even heroic. To the Greeks, it was more complicated. Many viewed her as a turncoat, someone who had betrayed her Hellenic roots to side with an Eastern despot. And yet, even Greek chroniclers, notably Herodotus, couldn't help but admire her intelligence and cunning. She was, in many ways, a mirror to their own contradictions, proving that not all Greeks stood with Greece and not all Persians were villains. She defied the lines that war tried to draw. And then there's the modern view, where historians and readers alike continue to wrestle with what she represents. A feminist icon before feminism? Maybe. A symbol of shrewd leadership in a world built to exclude her? Absolutely. Her legacy continues to fascinate, not because she fit the mold of ancient queens, but because she cracked it open. In military circles, she is still cited in naval histories, often as a rare case of a woman commanding warships in antiquity. In literary and political circles, she appears as a symbol of reason in an age of hubris. And in popular culture, she occasionally resurfaces, sometimes twisted, sometimes glamorized, but always unmistakable. But here's the truth. Artemisia didn't care about legacy, not in the way we do. She wasn't building a brand or writing memoirs. She was trying to survive, to rule, to win, and that's what makes her story so enduring. It wasn't shaped by vanity or myth-making. It was shaped by decisions, hard ones, controversial ones, and more often than not, the right ones. She didn't belong to Persia. She didn't belong to Greece. She belonged to herself. As the centuries passed, Artemisia's story did what all great stories eventually do. It mutated. She was no longer just a historical figure. She became myth, metaphor, and sometimes monster. Writers and dramatists reinvented her as they pleased. In some tales, she was a cruel seductress. In others, a warrior queen possessed by bloodlust. The real Artemisia, the tactician, the realist, the survivor, was buried under layers of fantasy and fear. Part of this distortion came from a simple truth. Men didn't know what to make of her, a woman who gave orders, who didn't crumble in the face of war, who told kings they were wrong and proved it. That didn't sit well with the ancient world. So, storytellers did what they often do when faced with a woman they can't control. They rewrote her. One bizarre legend claimed that she fell hopelessly in love with a man who didn't return her affections, and in a fit of despair, she threw herself from a cliff. Not exactly the kind of thing a steely naval commander does, but it served the narrative of turning strength into tragedy. Another version painted her as a venomous schemer, more witch than queen. It's a pattern that repeats across history. When a woman gains power through intellect or audacity, later generations either soften her into a damsel or darken her into a villain. Artemisia got both treatments, neither of which honored the truth. The real Artemisia didn't rule with seduction or superstition. She ruled with vision, reason, and cold strategic brilliance. She played a man's game by her own rules, and won. That, more than anything, terrified those who came after her. Because if one woman could do it, what was to stop others? Even in modern times, adaptations continue to distort her. Hollywood, for example, recast her as a vengeance-fueled femme fatale in 300, Rise of an Empire. Entertaining? Sure. Accurate? Absolutely not. But the fact that she still draws attention, still demands reinvention, proves one thing. Her legacy has teeth. The woman they feared didn't die. She evolved into myth, into memory, and into the long, uncomfortable question history keeps asking. What if more women had been like Artemisia? When Artemisia of Caria vanished from the records, she didn't vanish from history. She simply shifted form. Like the wake left behind a warship, her legacy rippled outward long after she sailed her final voyage. No grand tomb marks her resting place. No statues survive bearing her likeness. And yet her presence endures, etched into the bones of Halicarnassus, whispered in the pages of ancient chronicles, and debated in the halls of every historian trying to understand how she pulled off the impossible. Because Artemisia's life was exactly that. Impossible. She ruled when women weren't supposed to rule, fought in wars where women weren't supposed to fight, gave advice where women weren't supposed to speak. And still, somehow, she was heard. She wasn't merely tolerated, she was respected. That is perhaps her rarest achievement, not just surviving the ancient world as a woman in power, but earning the kind of grudging admiration that made even her enemies pause. Centuries later, her name remains a paradox, simultaneously exalted and obscured. She's not the household name that Cleopatra or Joan of Arc became, but perhaps that's fitting. Artemisia didn't chase legend. She chased outcomes. She wasn't adorned with mythic beauty or tragic romance. She was a leader, a realist, a strategist. Her drama played out not in poetry, but in the silence of war rooms, in the tight quarters of a ship, and in the long stare of a king who chose to listen. Today, her story invites re-examination, not just as a tale of a woman in a man's world, but as a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a crown or raise a sword. Sometimes it sits at the edge of power, says the uncomfortable thing, and sails straight into chaos. Artemisia didn't need to be rescued. She didn't need to be rewritten. What she needed, what she still deserves, is to be remembered as she was. Sharp, dangerous, brilliant. In an empire built by men, she charted her own course, across hostile seas, against cultural gravity, and through the fog of war. And as long as ships sail and history remembers those who dare to speak when silence is safer, Artemisia of Caria will never be truly gone. Before lenses and satellites, before Copernicus dared rearrange the cosmos, humanity had only two tools for unlocking the secrets of the sky: the naked eye and stone. And somehow that was enough. Across the ancient world, civilizations looked up, not just in wonder, but with intent. The stars were not mere decoration. They were calendars, compasses, gods, and prophecies. And so began the oldest science of all, astronomy. Long before it had a name, it was a necessity. Farmers needed to know when to plant. Sailors needed to know how to steer. Priests needed to know when to perform the right ritual at the right celestial moment. And astronomers, often indistinguishable from priests, kings, or mathematicians, were the ones everyone relied on. But without telescopes, how did they do it? They built temples, not just for worship, but for watching. Massive structures like Stonehenge in England, Nabta Playa in Egypt, and the Great Pyramids of Mesoamerica weren't just tombs or altars. They were observatories, carefully aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Many were designed to capture specific light patterns on solstices and equinoxes, sacred architecture with astronomical purpose. The great temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak in Egypt, for example, was oriented so that the sun would rise precisely between its pylons on the summer solstice. The Maya at Chichen Itza built El Castillo, a pyramid that casts a shadow of a serpent slithering down its staircase on the spring and autumn equinoxes. In India, vast stone instruments, like the Jantar Mantar, allowed astronomers to track the declination of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. These weren't accidents. These weren't crude guesses. These were deliberate, data-driven feats of cosmic engineering. And they weren't isolated. From the Andes to the Nile, from Babylon to Beijing, humans were building with the stars in mind, sinking stone with starlight. They charted planetary motions, eclipses, and even retrograde movement with nothing but patience, observation, and a deep sense of cosmic order. The sky wasn't just watched. It was measured, mapped, and built into the very bones of their cities. Long before glass could magnify the heavens, civilizations were already recording their rhythm in stone, in silence, and with astonishing accuracy. In the sun-baked floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians looked up and saw not just stars, but structure. Around 3000 BCE, they weren't simply telling stories about the heavens, they were organizing life around them. To the Sumerians, the sky wasn't random. It was a cosmic schedule, and their job was to interpret it correctly. These early astronomers laid the groundwork for what we now call celestial mechanics. They observed the regular motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and realized these movements weren't chaos. They were clocks. That's how they developed one of the earliest known calendars, dividing the year based on the lunar cycle. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably effective for tracking agricultural and ritual events. And speaking of time, the Sumerians gave us the sexagesimal system, the base 60 counting method still baked into how we measure minutes, seconds, and degrees. When you glance at a clock showing 60 minutes in an hour or 360 degrees in a circle, you're echoing a 5,000-year-old way of thinking. They didn't have telescopes, but they had ziggurats, stepped towers rising toward the heavens. From these platforms, priest astronomers kept careful records on clay tablets, noting when Venus appeared on the horizon, when the moon turned red during an eclipse, or when a star cluster returned after months below the horizon. Their word for these watchers, umanu, learned ones, both scientists and spiritual guides. Over time, Sumerian stargazing would evolve into something more systematic. Their descendants, the Babylonians, built vast star catalogs, predicted eclipses with eerie accuracy, and gave names to constellations that are still in use today. But it all began with the Sumerians scribbling celestial movements in cuneiform and laying down the earliest astronomical records we've ever found. Perhaps most impressive is how this early science blended seamlessly with mythology. To them, the sky was divine, yet predictable. The gods moved in patterns, and if you understood those patterns, you could align your crops, your rituals, and your fate. The Sumerians didn't just look up in awe. They looked up and began to measure. And in doing so, they started humanity's long relationship with the stars. If the Sumerians lit the first fire of astronomy, the Babylonians poured oil on it and turned it into an inferno of precision. By the time their empire flourished around 1800 BCE, Babylonian astronomers weren't just watching the skies. They were predicting them. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, retrograde motion, all charted, logged, and projected with stunning regularity. They weren't guessing, they were calculating. The Babylonians took the Sumerian observational legacy and supercharged it with math. They recorded the positions of stars, planets, and the moon on clay tablets known today as the Enuma Anu Enlil and the Mul Apin, some of the oldest known astronomical texts in existence. These weren't bedtime stories. They were raw data, line after line of celestial movements. When Venus would rise, how long it would shine, when a solar eclipse might strike. These tablets were essentially the world's first almanac. The most remarkable part, they could predict lunar eclipses using a pattern known as the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years after which eclipses repeat. They didn't understand why it worked, but they knew it did work, and that was enough. For a culture that fused divination with astronomy, being able to foresee cosmic events gave them enormous power, both spiritual and political. And while the Greeks are often credited with inventing the zodiac, the truth is the Babylonians got there first. They divided the sky into 12 equal parts, each anchored to a constellation, and laid the foundation for what would become the zodiac signs we still use and misuse today. Yes, when someone asks your sign, you can thank Babylon. But what really sets the Babylonians apart is their mathematical boldness. They tracked planetary motion, even retrograde paths, and used arithmetic methods to approximate celestial cycles. Not geometric models, mind you, that would come later with the Greeks, but arithmetic that worked. And for practical purposes, that was more than enough. They saw the universe as a ledger of patterns, a giant machine of repeating cycles. And their astronomers were not just mystics or priests, they were early scientists, hunched over tablets, decoding the rhythms of the cosmos in symbols and numbers. In the dark, they wrote the sky. While the Babylonians were busy predicting eclipses, the ancient Egyptians were syncing their entire civilization to the stars, quite literally. In the Nile Valley, astronomy wasn't just a curiosity, it was survival. And at the heart of it all was a single star, Sirius, the brightest light in the night sky. The Egyptians noticed something extraordinary. Each year, just before the annual flooding of the Nile, Sirius would reappear on the horizon during dawn. This event, known as the Heliacal Rising of Sirius, became the cornerstone of their calendar. That wasn't just poetic, it was vital. The Nile's floodwaters determined crop cycles, and missing that window could mean famine. So, the Egyptians created a 365-day solar calendar, divided into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 festival days. It was remarkably close to our modern calendar, centuries before Julius Caesar ever got involved. But the Egyptians didn't stop with Sirius. They tracked the sun, moon, and stars from their temples, many of which were aligned with astonishing astronomical precision. The Temple of Karnak, for instance, was oriented so the sun would rise directly through its axis during the summer solstice. Other temples lined up with the rising and setting of stars considered sacred. And then there were the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2560 BCE, was aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points. Its shafts may have been pointed towards specific stars, possibly Orion and Sirius, hinting at a celestial connection between the heavens and the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. This wasn't just burial architecture, it was cosmological engineering. Egyptian priests often served double duty as astronomers. They observed the skies not only for ritual timing, but for signs, omens, and the will of the gods. Astronomy, theology, and governance were tightly interwoven. To rule Egypt was to understand the sky. What's remarkable is that without telescopes, without even lenses, they developed an entire system for tracking time, orienting buildings, and forecasting natural events, all based on patient observation and relentless precision. The Egyptians didn't look at the sky for entertainment. They looked up and saw a divine clock ticking with purpose, echoing eternity. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, long before Europeans set foot in the New World, the Maya were building one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems the world had ever seen. Without metal tools, without wheels, and without telescopes, they mapped the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with a precision that still baffles modern scholars. To the Maya, astronomy was not a luxury of the learned elite. It was the framework of society itself. Their rulers were seen as cosmic intermediaries, and every major political or religious event was timed to match a celestial counterpart. Eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, and Venus cycles weren't just observed. They were used to legitimize power. One of their most striking achievements was their tracking of Venus. The Maya noted that Venus disappeared and reappeared in the sky in a repeating cycle of 584 days, and they tied this rhythm into their ritual warfare and calendar systems. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian manuscripts, contains a Venus table that tracks the planet's movements over hundreds of years, with an error of less than 1 day. They didn't stop there. The Maya had the long count calendar, capable of tracking dates over spans of thousands of years. They understood the solar year with incredible accuracy, about 365.242 days, remarkably close to the modern value. Their calendar systems were so refined that multiple ones ran simultaneously. The 260-day ritual calendar, Tzolk'in, the 365-day solar calendar, Hab, and the long count for historical chronology. And the observatories. They didn't have glass domes, but they had stone genius. The El Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza was built with specific windows and alignments that allowed Maya priests to track the movements of Venus and the Sun. Temple staircases and shadow effects were timed to equinoxes, like the famous serpent shadow that slithers down El Castillo during the spring and autumn. The Maya weren't just watching the skies. They were synchronizing their civilization with them. Their kings ruled by the stars. Their temples rose in tune with solstices, and their wars were timed with the wanderings of Venus. They didn't just read the cosmos. They wove it into the fabric of life. In ancient China, astronomy wasn't simply a science. It was a matter of state. The emperor, regarded as the son of heaven, ruled with the mandate of heaven, a cosmic endorsement that could be revoked if the stars sent the wrong message. That made astronomy both sacred and political. If the sky changed, so could the dynasty. As early as 2000 BCE, Chinese astronomers were tracking celestial events and documenting them with methodical care. They recorded comets, novae, eclipses, sunspots, and planetary motions. Some of these records, like those found in the Shiji, records of the Grand Historian, and the Book of Han, are still referenced by modern scientists today to verify ancient astronomical phenomena. Perhaps most remarkable is their documentation of a supernova explosion in 1054 CE, visible in daylight for 23 days. Chinese astronomers recorded its location with such accuracy that modern astronomers used the data to identify the remnants, now known as the Crab Nebula. But China's astronomical prowess didn't rely on mystical interpretation alone. They developed mechanical devices such as armillary spheres and gnomons, shadow-casting rods to measure the altitude of the sun and the positions of stars. In fact, the Chinese had working water-driven celestial globes and astronomical clocks centuries before Europe caught up. Chinese astronomers divided the sky into 28 lunar mansions, similar in concept to Western constellations, and used them for both navigation and timekeeping. They also created the Chinese lunisolar calendar, which balanced lunar months with the solar year and remains in use today to determine traditional holidays like the Lunar New Year. One of their key contributions was the meticulous recording of eclipses. They not only predicted solar and lunar eclipses, but sometimes tied them to dynastic omens. If an eclipse occurred and the emperor hadn't been forewarned, it was considered a failure of the astronomers, and sometimes a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. In short, astronomy in China wasn't tucked away in a scholar's study. It stood at the very core of governance, divinity, and national survival. The stars didn't just tell time. They told truth, and the empire listened. In ancient India, astronomy was never a separate discipline. It was interwoven with philosophy, ritual, mathematics, and metaphysics. Known as Jyotisha, the science of light, Indian astronomy began as a tool for determining auspicious timings for rituals. but evolved into one of the most mathematically advanced systems of celestial observation in the ancient world. The earliest references to celestial events appear in the Vedas, composed around 1500 BCE. These sacred texts mention the sun, moon, and planetary cycles, as well as the division of the sky into 27 nakshatras, lunar mansions that formed the core of early Indian sky mapping. These nakshatras were tied to both mythology and calculation, forming the basis of astrological charts and calendars still used in India today. But Indian astronomy wasn't just poetic, it was shockingly precise. Ancient scholars developed models for the solar year that were more accurate than the Julian calendar introduced much later by the Romans. The Surya Siddhanta, a foundational astronomical text compiled around 500 CE based on earlier knowledge, describes the Earth's axial tilt, the elliptical orbits of planets, and even the concept of gravity centuries before Newton. Perhaps the most revolutionary figure in Indian astronomy was Aryabhata, who in 499 CE proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis daily, a theory rarely entertained in other parts of the world at that time. He also calculated the length of the solar year at 365.358 days, just a tiny fraction off from modern values, and developed advanced trigonometric functions to assist in astronomical calculations. Indian astronomers also created sophisticated sundials, worked with decimal notation, and used shadow instruments and spheres to measure angles and altitudes. Observatories were often aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. But beyond technical achievements, Indian astronomy carried a cosmic elegance. The universe wasn't just a machine, it was a cycle, a dance of time and space unfolding endlessly. Astronomy wasn't about domination over nature, it was about harmony with it. In the Indian worldview, understanding the heavens was a way of understanding the self, a geometry of spirit where planets moved not just across the sky, but through the soul. If other civilizations looked to the sky for guidance, ritual, or survival, the ancient Greeks looked up and asked why. Why do the stars move? Why do planets wander? And most importantly, can the cosmos be explained by reason? Greek astronomy marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with the heavens. Where others saw patterns and portents, the Greeks sought laws. They weren't just observers, they were theorists, trying to decode the sky using mathematics, geometry, and philosophy. It began with Thales of Miletus, one of the first to suggest that celestial phenomena had natural causes. Then came Anaximander, who imagined the Earth floating in space unsupported and suggested that the heavens formed a sphere. These ideas may sound crude today, but for their time, they were revolutionary. The true leap came with Pythagoras, who viewed the cosmos as a system of perfect harmony, a music of the spheres governed by mathematical ratios. His followers believed the universe could be understood through numbers, laying the foundation for theoretical astronomy. But it was Aristarchus of Samos who came closest to modern truth. In the 3rd century BCE, he proposed a heliocentric model, with the sun, not the Earth, at the center of the universe. His ideas were ignored for nearly 2,000 years, but they planted a seed that would later bloom with Copernicus. Then came Hipparchus, the father of observational astronomy. He created the first star catalog, divided stars by brightness, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and developed trigonometric tools to calculate celestial positions. His accuracy was astonishing. especially without telescopes. And finally, there was Claudius Ptolemy, whose Almagest became the authoritative astronomical text for over a millennium. He synthesized Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian knowledge into a geocentric model that explained planetary motion using epicycles and deference, a complex yet elegant system that worked until it didn't. While some Greek ideas were wrong, their commitment to rational explanation and systematic modeling changed the game. They taught the world that the stars weren't random. They were governed by patterns that the human mind could understand. With the Greeks, astronomy became more than observation. It became an argument between earth and sky, between logic and myth, and between what we see and what we know. By the time the telescope was invented in the early 17th century, humanity had already spent thousands of years watching the skies with nothing but eyes, shadows, and stone. And yet what those ancient civilizations achieved is nothing short of astonishing. They mapped stars, tracked planets, predicted eclipses, and built monuments aligned with solstices and equinoxes, all without lenses, satellites, or electricity. What makes their accomplishments even more extraordinary is that they did it independently. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Maya in Mesoamerica, the Chinese and Indians in Asia, the Greeks and Egyptians around the Mediterranean, they all developed astronomical systems rooted in their own worldviews. Yet, despite being oceans apart, they arrived at similar conclusions. The heavens move with order, and that order matters. Ancient astronomy wasn't confined to ivory towers. It shaped agriculture, religion, architecture, politics, and philosophy. It dictated when to plant, when to pray, when to build, and when to rule. In every culture, understanding the sky was seen as a way of understanding the divine, or at the very least, one's place in the vast machinery of existence. And while their models varied, some geocentric, some mythological, some cyclical, they all shared one trait: a deep, unwavering respect for the cosmos. For many ancient peoples, the sky wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive, deliberate, and sacred. The telescope would eventually change everything. It revealed moons circling Jupiter, phases of Venus, sunspots, and galaxies far beyond our own. But the groundwork, the patient mapping, the systematic records, the sheer curiosity that belonged to the ancients. Today, we carry their legacy every time we check a calendar, map the stars with a phone app, or celebrate a solstice. Every GPS, satellite, and space mission is built on a foundation they laid in clay, stone, and papyrus. They didn't know about black holes or cosmic microwave backgrounds, but they asked the right questions. They looked up, and they noticed. In the darkness, without knowing it, they became the first scientists. Quietly, faithfully, they wrote their questions in the sky. And thanks to them, we now have the tools to look deeper, not just into space, but into our own origins. In 1803, something unprecedented happened. A young republic, barely 3 decades old, bought a landmass so vast it doubled its territory overnight. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a real estate deal. It was a geopolitical thunderclap. With the stroke of a pen, the United States acquired more than 828,000 square miles of land from France, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. 13 future states would eventually rise from this vast, fertile terrain. And the price? A cool $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. But what makes this even more extraordinary is that no one, not even the Americans, saw it coming. At the time, President Thomas Jefferson had one goal: to secure access to the Mississippi River and the crucial port city of New Orleans. The young nation was heavily dependent on river trade. Farmers in the Ohio Valley needed to float their goods south, and whoever controlled New Orleans held the keys to economic survival. Jefferson authorized diplomats to offer France up to $10 million just for New Orleans and some nearby lands. That's it. But when those diplomats arrived, they were blindsided. The French had a counteroffer. Not just New Orleans, the entire Louisiana territory. Why? France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, was shifting its priorities. Napoleon had dreams of a grand North American empire, but the Haitian Revolution had crushed French ambitions in the Caribbean. Disease, rebellion, and mounting tensions with Britain made holding on to Louisiana more trouble than it was worth. Napoleon needed money for war, not swamps and prairie. Faced with an unexpected opportunity, the American negotiators said yes, quickly, even before they could get full approval from Jefferson. After all, this wasn't just a port. It was the Mississippi River, the Great Plains, access to the Rocky Mountains, and future control over the heart of the continent. What Jefferson received wasn't just land. It was destiny, a blank canvas for westward expansion, national growth, and inevitably conflict. But while newspapers celebrated, one truth was ignored. This land was not empty. It was already home to dozens of native nations, each with their own histories, alliances, and claims. And so, a deal made in Paris would not only reshape maps, it would alter lives across an entire continent. At the heart of the Louisiana Purchase stood one man with a crown and a headache: Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1803, the French emperor was fighting on too many fronts: in Europe, in the Caribbean, and in his own treasury. And so, in an act that shocked nearly everyone involved, he offered to sell off a third of North America to the very country he had once hoped to block from continental power. It hadn't started that way. Just a few years earlier, France had secretly acquired Louisiana from Spain under the Treaty of San Ildefonso. Napoleon had grand dreams of restoring a French colonial empire. Louisiana would feed Saint-Domingue, the crown jewel of France's Caribbean colonies, today known as Haiti, with wheat, meat, and supplies. France didn't want Louisiana for its own sake. It wanted it to support sugar. But that vision collapsed in fire and fever. The Haitian Revolution, led by formerly enslaved people under leaders like Toussaint Louverture, had erupted into full rebellion. France sent tens of thousands of troops to crush it, and watched them die by the thousands, not just from battle, but from yellow fever. Napoleon lost his best general, his army, and his chance to reclaim the richest sugar colony on earth. With Saint-Domingue slipping away, Louisiana became irrelevant. Worse than irrelevant, it was now indefensible. And with Britain preparing for another war against France, Napoleon feared Louisiana might be taken by force. So instead of fighting to keep it, he sold it. And in typical Napoleon fashion, the decision was fast, bold, and entirely pragmatic. On April 11, 1803, he stunned American diplomats Robert Livingston and James Monroe with an offer: all of Louisiana, not just New Orleans. For 15 million. Napoleon's reasoning was simple. I have given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride. He didn't just want money. He wanted the U.S. to grow strong enough to stand against Britain. Selling Louisiana wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And so, in a single act, Napoleon abandoned his American empire and changed the future of a country he barely respected. What was an imperial afterthought to him would become the launching pad for America's expansion west, and the beginning of the end for native sovereignty across the continent. Thomas Jefferson had long envisioned an agrarian republic, a nation of independent farmers living on their own land, bound together by liberty and civic virtue. The Louisiana Purchase should have been his dream come true, but instead, it gave him a constitutional nightmare. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government should only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. And guess what? Nowhere in that document did it say the U.S. government could buy foreign territory. There was no clause for purchasing a continent, no legal roadmap for doubling the size of the nation in one transaction. So Jefferson hesitated. The offer from Napoleon was almost too good to be true. $15 million for land stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It was a once-in-a-civilization opportunity, but Jefferson wrestled with the contradiction. Could he, a man who feared federal overreach, stretch the Constitution to justify such a massive acquisition? In private, he considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But the clock was ticking, and political realities loomed. If he delayed, Napoleon might change his mind, or Britain might seize the territory before the ink could dry. So Jefferson did something ironic. He embraced implied powers, the very thing he had criticized Alexander Hamilton for advocating years earlier. He rationalized the purchase as a treaty, which the Constitution did allow the president to make with Senate approval. The Senate ratified the deal in October 1803 with overwhelming support. And Jefferson, while quietly uneasy, defended his decision as necessary for the survival and security of the Republic. And just like that, Jefferson, the constitutional purist, became the architect of the largest peaceful land acquisition in U.S. history. The contradiction wasn't lost on his critics, who called him a hypocrite, but Jefferson saw it as a necessary compromise, bending the Constitution, in his view, to preserve the Republic rather than destroy it. In doing so, he set a precedent. The federal government could acquire land by treaty, even without explicit constitutional authority. And that precedent would be invoked again and again as the United States expanded further west and into territories already lived on by others. The Louisiana Purchase had been signed, sealed, and ratified. But nobody really knew what the U.S. had just bought. The land was vast, sparsely mapped, and filled with unknown rivers, mountains, species, and people. So, in 1804, President Jefferson commissioned an expedition that would become one of the most iconic journeys in American history, the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was ambitious: explore the new territory, establish trade with native nations, study the land's resources, and, most importantly, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson dreamed of a Northwest Passage, a navigable link between the Atlantic and Pacific that would revolutionize trade. Spoiler, it didn't exist. But what Lewis and Clark found would still transform how Americans saw their place on the continent. They started in St. Louis in May 1804 with a team of over 30 men, and headed upriver into land untouched by American settlers. Along the way, they documented over 100 new animal species and 178 new plants. They mapped rivers, sketched mountains, and kept meticulous journals filled with scientific and ethnographic observations. But they didn't do it alone. One of the most essential figures on the journey was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who joined the expedition with her French-Canadian husband. Sacagawea was not just a translator, she was a symbol of peace. Her presence, with a child, signaled to native tribes that this was not a war party. Her knowledge of geography and diplomacy helped the Corps survive dangerous crossings and build crucial alliances. Over 2 years, the expedition traveled more than 8,000 miles, all by boat, horse, and foot. They reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805, built a fort for the winter, and returned east by 1806. They didn't find a Northwest Passage, but they brought back something arguably more valuable: a detailed account of the newly acquired land and the people who lived there. Jefferson had purchased a mystery. Lewis and Clark began to make it real. But while their reports inspired dreams of westward expansion, they also foreshadowed something darker: the coming pressure on indigenous nations and the inevitable push toward conquest under the banner of discovery. To American politicians and settlers, the Louisiana Purchase was a land bonanza, a blank slate for farms, cities, and ambition. But to the native nations who had lived there for centuries, it was something else entirely: the beginning of erasure. The land the U.S. had purchased from France was already home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations, each with its own language, territory, and system of governance. From the Osage and Sioux to the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Mandan, these communities had been managing the land, trading with one another, and making alliances long before any European flag had been planted. But in the eyes of Jefferson and future U.S. leaders, the Louisiana Territory was a canvas, vast, underused, and ripe for American settlement. The native nations who lived there were not consulted in the deal. They weren't notified. They weren't compensated. One day they were sovereign peoples. The next, they were declared subjects of the expanding American Republic. Jefferson believed native people could either assimilate into American society or relocate peacefully, if possible, but forcibly if necessary. In private letters, he wrote that, as settlers moved west, indigenous people would have to move westward too, or perish. It wasn't yet called removal, but the idea was already forming. This pressure intensified after the Lewis and Clark expedition returned with news of abundant land and natural wealth. The federal government began negotiating treaties, many of them deceptive or coercive, to claim land and push tribes farther west. In some cases, military force backed these efforts. In others, it was disease and displacement that did the work. The Louisiana Purchase marked the start of a new phase in U.S. expansion, manifest destiny before it had a name. The belief that the United States was meant to control the continent had its legal foundation in this sale, and its moral cost in the lives and lands of native nations. For indigenous peoples, the Louisiana Purchase was not a transaction. It was a trespass. It redrew maps that had never been theirs, erased boundaries that had never been acknowledged, and unleashed a wave of settlers who came not to trade, but to take. And that wave was only just beginning. The Louisiana Purchase was hailed as a triumph, a peaceful acquisition of territory that nearly doubled the size of the United States. But while the land deal was clean on paper, the reality on the ground was anything but. Expansion came with a price, paid not in gold, but in conflict, displacement, and cultural destruction. With the new territory secured, American settlers began flooding westward, driven by hopes of fertile farmland, personal freedom, and economic opportunity. They pushed into lands still inhabited by indigenous nations. The federal government followed, establishing forts, roads, and administrative posts to manage and enforce its new authority. This set the stage for a slow-burning collision between two visions of the land, one that saw it as property to be claimed and improved, and another that saw it as a living entity to be shared and respected. Unsurprisingly, conflict erupted. Skirmishes turned into wars. Treaties were signed, then broken. And slowly, the frontier line moved further west, pushed by the force of rifles, railroads, and relentless ambition. But it wasn't just indigenous nations who paid a price. The Louisiana Territory also intensified a moral crisis that would eventually fracture the nation: slavery. Southern leaders immediately saw the vast new lands as an opportunity to expand plantation agriculture. Cotton and sugar thrived in the southern parts of the territory, and enslaved labor was seen as essential to making it profitable. This raised an explosive question: would slavery be allowed in the new territories? The answer would haunt Congress for decades. It led to the Missouri Compromise, sectional tensions, and eventually the Civil War. The Louisiana Territory didn't just stretch America's borders, it stretched its political fabric to the breaking point. And there were environmental consequences, too. The rivers were dammed, the plains plowed, the buffalo nearly wiped out. The transformation was rapid and irreversible. What had once been a landscape shaped by fire, herds, and indigenous stewardship became a patchwork of farms, fences, and industrial extraction. In seizing the land, the United States also inherited the burden of what it had done, a legacy that still echoes in debates over land rights, tribal sovereignty, and reparations. The land may have been purchased, but the real cost is still being paid. Once the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase, a new question emerged. How exactly do you govern a territory so vast it defied imagination? The land stretched over what would become all or part of 15 modern U.S. states, from Louisiana to Montana, and from the Dakotas to Colorado. But in 1803, it was an undefined wilderness, full of possibilities, but with few roads, no towns, and countless competing claims. The first step was surveying, mapping out borders, rivers, mountains, and eventually property lines. Expeditions like those, led by Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, and others, laid the groundwork. Cartographers, land speculators, and military engineers followed, drawing maps that would slowly become county lines, reservations, and state borders. What had been an open and interconnected indigenous world was now being chopped into rectangles. Congress passed laws to organize the territory, first as military districts, then as organized territories, each with governors appointed by the federal government. These new administrative units followed the pattern established by the Northwest Ordinance. Once a territory had enough settlers, it could apply for statehood. But not all borders were drawn with logic or justice. Take the creation of Missouri in 1821, the first state carved from the Purchase. Its admission triggered national uproar because Missouri wanted to allow slavery. The resulting Missouri Compromise drew an imaginary line across the Purchase. Slavery would be allowed south of it, banned to the north. That single line would haunt American politics for decades, as each new state's status threatened to tip the balance between North and South. Meanwhile, white settlers poured into the new territories, often ahead of the law. They claimed land through preemption, squatting, and increasingly through federally sponsored land grants. Native peoples, even those with existing treaties, found their land suddenly reclassified, first as territory, then as open land, then as someone else's farm. And while maps were being filled in, they were also erasing native trails, erasing seasonal migrations, erasing indigenous names, and replacing them with names like Jefferson City, Baton Rouge, and Fort Pierre. Borders in this new vision of America weren't just lines on a map. They were tools of control, ways to claim, divide, sell, and govern land that just a few years earlier had belonged to no president, no state, and certainly no empire. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just reshape America's borders, it redefined its identity. With one diplomatic stroke, the United States went from a coastal republic hugging the Atlantic to a continental power stretching toward the unknown. It was the first great leap of manifest destiny, even before the term existed, and it set the tone for the next century of expansion, conquest, and reinvention. Politically, the Purchase established the precedent that the federal government could acquire new land through treaty, even without clear constitutional guidance. That precedent would be used again with Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii. The U.S. became not just a country, but a collector of territory, a nation always looking westward. Culturally, it fed a new kind of American myth, that of the frontier. The Louisiana Territory became the backdrop for stories of rugged settlers, daring explorers, and wide-open possibility. But for every pioneer's dream, there was a native nightmare, a memory of land lost, treaties broken, and people pushed further into exile. Economically, the impact was staggering. The Mississippi River became the artery of American commerce. Cities like St. Louis, New Orleans, and Kansas City grew into vital trade hubs. Fertile plains turned into farmland, and the discovery of gold, silver, and other natural resources would turn portions of the Purchase into engines of industrial growth. But the deeper legacy is a contradiction. The Purchase represented American ideals: opportunity, growth, independence, and yet it also embodied America's deepest failures: dispossession, slavery, imperial ambition. It's a story of triumph, written on land taken from others, often violently. Today, the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase define states that millions call home. Highways crisscross where buffalo once roamed. Fields of wheat now grow where sacred grounds once stood. And yet, beneath the soil and asphalt, the memory of that Purchase still lingers, not just as a transaction, but as a turning point. The United States was forever changed by it. So was the world. But the question remains, was the cost purely monetary, or was it, as many would later argue, measured in lives, cultures, and landscapes that could never be bought back? In the end, the Louisiana Purchase was more than a land deal. It was a defining moment, a shift in American identity from a fragile republic clinging to the eastern seaboard to an empire in the making, stretching boldly into the interior. The ink dried in Paris, but the consequences echoed across prairies, rivers, and generations. For the United States, it meant possibility. It sparked a new national confidence, a belief that expansion was not only desirable, but inevitable. That belief would harden into policy, becoming manifest destiny, and would eventually drive the U.S. to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. It also cemented a model of power built on land acquisition, displacement, and development. The West was no longer a mystery. It was a target. And for settlers, speculators, and politicians, it was an open invitation to seize opportunity by uprooting what already existed. For Native nations, the transformation was catastrophic. The land they had lived on, traded through, fought for, and honored was suddenly owned, not by an invading army, but by a distant government that claimed to have bought it. There were no negotiations, no consent, just a line on a map and a new set of rules. The arrival of American settlers accelerated cycles of violence, forced removals, and cultural devastation. Treaties came and went, reservations were drawn, bison were slaughtered, languages faded. By the time the dust settled, the native presence in the Louisiana Territory had been largely confined, silenced, or erased, though never extinguished. And yet, the legacy of the purchase remains layered. The cities, economies, and infrastructure that emerged from it helped shape the modern United States. The rivers it granted became lifelines. The natural resources it offered fueled industrial growth. The space it opened allowed for innovation, diversity, and reinvention. But the shadow of that deal still lingers. The Louisiana Purchase stands today as a paradox, a bold diplomatic victory and a blueprint for displacement. It's a story of growth and grief, of ambition and amnesia. It made the United States what it is, but it also forced a reckoning that continues to this day. How do you celebrate a land you never truly asked for and can never truly return?